Alright, let's strip away the hype and get real. Every secret has a way of clawing its way into the light, but when that secret is you, your life, your identity, it stops being about simple exposure. It's about raw, unadulterated power. Ever imagined waking up to discover that the FBI isn't just watching you? They've announced you like a blockbuster headline they just couldn't resist. Not whispered rumors, not shadowy glimpses, but a full-blown declaration, a checkmate on their twisted board. Sounds like a thriller, doesn't it? But here's the kicker. The uncomfortable truth they don't want you to grasp: over 90% of government leaks aren't accidents. They're calculated plays, strategic moves on a vast unseen chessboard. So if your name somehow slipped through the cracks, believe me, it wasn't clumsiness, it was damn well choreographed. This isn't just about privacy evaporating. This is about being thrust into a high-stakes game where every single move is deliberate, loaded with intent. Think about it, most people will go through their entire lives unnoticed, invisible, their stories unwritten. Yet here you are, suddenly a strategic anomaly, significant enough to be leaked, tracked, and labeled like you're the shock ending of a movie playing out in secret. And here's where the bitter humor comes in. You were probably just trying to navigate life, maybe struggling with a dodgy phone bill or a painfully slow internet connection. Meanwhile, somewhere in a sterile federal office, someone was moving your name around like a rook on a chessboard, plotting your next move. Talk about multitasking. You were just trying to survive Monday, and they were busy turning you into classified entertainment. Can you feel the sting of that? So let's dive deep into why this supposed exposure wasn't just a leak. It was a deliberate declaration, a calculated strategic maneuver, and ultimately an unintentional spotlight on a truth they desperately wanted to keep hidden. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll realize that the checkmate wasn't yours to fear. It was theirs to admit. So let's get to the point. Timer number 1. Exposure became the undeniable proof you were always hunted. For years, the people around you may have dismissed your concerns, laughed at your suspicions, and told you it was all in your head. They may have mocked you, saying you were paranoid. They laughed at the idea that forces beyond your immediate world could be watching you. But then your identity was leaked, and it was directly tied to the FBI's radar. Suddenly everything shifted. Can you recall that feeling? Suddenly the accusations of paranoia lost their bite. The so-called conspiracy wasn't in your imagination. It was documented in files, and now shockingly in plain sight. The very thing they tried so desperately to conceal turned into undeniable, rock-solid evidence. This kind of exposure functions like a stamp of truth forever branded on the narrative. If you weren't important, there would be no reason for your name to be recorded, tracked, and then leaked in the first place. It proves that you were never just a casual target of gossip or a victim of petty neighborhood envy. You were part of something far larger, something that demanded strategies, cover-ups, and meticulously calculated moves to contain you. Being hunted wasn't just a feeling, a nagging suspicion. It was a cold, hard fact confirmed by the very institutions that thought they could control the story. What makes this revelation so poignant for those who doubted you is that the exposure didn't destroy you. It vindicated you. The leak may have revealed your identity, but it also revealed their obsession, their relentless pursuit. It told the world that you weren't crazy for sensing watchful eyes, never wrong for believing that something far deeper was at play. When the FBI leaves footprints, even in the form of a supposed leak, it's an implicit admission that you were already a subject of intense interest long before anyone else believed it. Exposure like this is a double-edged sword. On their side, it reveals desperation. They had to bring you out into the open because containing you in the shadows simply wasn't working anymore. On your side, it confirms strength. You survived being hunted without even fully realizing the weight of the forces arrayed against you. That's the brutal irony of it all. They spent years maneuvering, plotting, and strategizing while you were simply trying to live your life blissfully unaware that you were central to a warped board game you never asked to participate in. The leak, instead of discrediting you, revealed the truth they tried so desperately to bury. You weren't imagining the pressure. You were being studied, tested, monitored. And now, with the evidence out in the open, no one can ever erase the undeniable fact that you were always hunted because exposure became undeniable proof. Feel the weight of that truth. Now let's move forward. Number 2. The leak wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move on the board. At the level where the FBI operates, nothing slips out by accident. Files don't just float into the public domain by mistake. When your identity was exposed, it wasn't carelessness. It was choreography. A deliberate play made to test reactions, shift energy, and send a carefully crafted message. Leaks are often used as tools, not mishaps. They're weapons of strategy, not random glitches in the system. And in this case, the leak wasn't about exposing you per se. It was about observing how the exposure would play out, how it would affect the game. This is what most people miss when powerful systems make a move. They're already several steps ahead, anticipating every possible consequence. They don't just drop a name for the sake of cheap drama. They drop it to carefully study the ripple effects. How will the people around you respond? How will you respond? Who will panic? Who will scatter? Who will align themselves with you and who will betray you? That's what a leak truly measures. It's less about the raw information itself and far more about the complex chain reaction it unleashes. And in that sense, your exposure wasn't clumsy or accidental. It was a calculated test of influence, a probe to gauge your strength. By calling it a move on the board, it underscores the reality that you've been in a chess game all along, whether you were aware of it or not. Ordinary people aren't part of these games. They live outside the strategic framework, practically invisible to the machinations of larger systems. But when your identity was deliberately leaked, it was a clear sign that you're not ordinary. You're a piece worth moving, worth protecting. And more than that, you're a piece that has to be moved with extreme care because the wrong move against you could unravel far more than they ever intended. The very fact that your name was revealed as part of a strategic leak also hints at a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. They couldn't keep you hidden any longer. Containment was failing. Silence wasn't working. So they were forced to shift tactics to try a new strategy. In chess, a player doesn't reveal a valuable piece without a damn good reason. It's always tied to the long game, to a calculated strategy unfolding over time. That's precisely what this leak represents. They played their hand not because they wanted to, but because the sheer pressure of your presence forced them to. So when your identity was exposed, don't mistake it for a simple error, an unfortunate slip-up. It was the clearest sign yet that you've been on the board the entire time, and they just admitted it by making a move they can't ever take back. Take a moment to let that sink in. Now let's go further. Number 3, your very existence became a classified problem. Most people move through life without ever catching the eye of a system larger than their immediate environment. Their names never appear on sensitive files, their actions never trigger any alarms, and their choices never ripple beyond their personal circle. But when your identity surfaced and became tied to federal interest, it signaled something fundamentally different, something significant. You weren't just living, you were disrupting, actively changing the game. You weren't just surviving, you were setting off alarms that placed you in categories reserved for anomalies, outliers, and unpredictable forces. To be labeled a classified problem means that your very presence created complications, that you challenged their control. Systems thrive on predictability, on carefully calculated metrics. They're built on patterns, statistics, and probabilities. Ordinary citizens are easy to measure, easy to anticipate, easy to control. But then someone like you appears, someone whose moves defy the formulas, whose resilience doesn't match the projections, whose survival goes against all the odds. And suddenly you're no longer just a case study. You're a direct threat to the established structure, a wrench in the carefully oiled machinery. Your life stops being that of a private citizen and transforms into an uncontrollable variable, a wild card in their meticulously crafted game. That's precisely why your identity ended up in files and systems you never signed up for, why they are keeping tabs on you. This shift also explains why exposure became necessary. A classified problem can't remain hidden in the shadows forever because the system ultimately needs to act, and action requires acknowledgement, a formal decision. To leak your name, to tag you as a strategic checkmate, wasn't just a game, not a playful move. It was an implicit admission that they've been trying desperately to manage a reality too large, too chaotic to ignore. They couldn't contain you privately any longer, so they made it public, mistakenly thinking it would somehow diminish your influence, limit your power. Ironically, it only served to confirm it, to amplify your voice. Becoming a classified problem also carries weight far beyond the personal. It reveals that your story has impact beyond your own immediate life, that your choices touch domains you can't always see, that you affect things. If you had been irrelevant, they would have happily let you live quietly unnoticed. The fact that you weren't granted that luxury proves that your existence destabilized something they thought was untouchable, that it broke a sacred rule. And instead of removing you quietly, they ended up highlighting you, making your name an integral part of a narrative they desperately hoped to control, but ultimately tragically exposed. That's the devastating paradox at the heart of it all. To mark you as a classified problem, they elevated you. They transformed your life into evidence of something extraordinary, something to be feared. And now the truth is undeniable. Your existence wasn't just noticed. It was meticulously studied, actively contained, and finally leaked because you were never ordinary enough to be ignored, never quiet enough to be dismissed. Pause. Breathe. Recognize your power. Now let's continue. Number 4. What they called a leak was actually an admission of defeat. When systems this powerful let sensitive information slip, it's rarely a genuine mistake. They disguise it as a breach, a mishap, or a careless oversight, but beneath the surface, it's often an indirect way of acknowledging something they can't openly admit. By allowing your identity to slip through the cracks, they confirmed what they've been actively denying all along. You matter far more than they ever wanted to acknowledge. If you were truly insignificant, your name would never have made it to their files, much less their headlines. Governments don't waste valuable time or resources on matters that carry no weight on things that have no power. That's why this supposed leak is so layered, so intricate. On the surface, it appears to be simple exposure, a careless revealing. But underneath, it's an involuntary confession, an admission of something far deeper. The moment your name became entangled with their narrative, they validated your impact, your power. They essentially stamped your life with a seal of recognition, even as they attempted to frame it negatively. That's the twisted irony of it all. In their desperate attempt to control the narrative, they inadvertently verified your place in it, affirming your significance. The real power in this kind of admission isn't in the raw data they released. Data is simply numbers, details, paperwork. What makes this so significant is the underlying subtext, the hidden message. The subtext says that you were never invisible, never irrelevant. The subtext says that they tracked you, studied you, and followed you because you were already bending the environment around you, shaping the world. The subtext says that you were always on the board, even when they tried their best to convince you that you were utterly irrelevant, insignificant. This is where many people miss the deeper truth. A leak framed as a weapon can backfire spectacularly when people realize that it's actually proof of your inherent importance. By trying to reduce you to files and exposure, they inadvertently told the world that you were significant enough to warrant their undivided energy in the first place. The leak becomes less about you being revealed and far more about them being exposed for their obsessive tracking, for their deep-seated fear, for their fundamental inability to control what you represent. That's why this leak carries far more weight than it initially seems. It isn't just about your identity being revealed to the public. It's about their silent confession that your influence was simply too great to be ignored, too powerful to be dismissed. And once an admission like that is made, they can never truly take it back, can never retract the unspoken truth. They mistakenly thought they were weakening you, but in reality they made you undeniable, impossible to ignore. Think about it. Now let's keep going. Number 5. The FBI didn't just unmask you, they verified your very existence. An identity leak of this magnitude isn't just about being revealed to the world, about suddenly losing your anonymity. It's about being confirmed in a way that no critic, no skeptic, no hater can ever truly undo. People may have spent years doubting your experiences, dismissing your voice, or laughing off your deepest suspicions. They may have thought you were exaggerating, being paranoid, or simply making things up. But once your name lands in federal files and becomes part of a calculated leak, the entire conversation changes. Suddenly, what you've been saying about being watched, studied, or deliberately targeted is no longer just speculation or unfounded rumor. It's documented, it's official. This is the critical difference between exposure and true validation. Exposure is primarily about visibility, about simply being seen by the world. Validation, on the other hand, is about being formally recognized as real, official, and undeniably true. By leaking your identity, the system unintentionally provided you with the kind of evidence that no one can effectively argue with their own meticulously kept records. And that's a level of proof that most people never even come close to obtaining. It means that you weren't just a lone voice in the wilderness shouting into the void. You were a name on a file they considered important enough to actively move, meticulously track, and eventually intentionally release. That kind of validation cuts directly through the noise of doubt in a way that almost nothing else can. Family members who dismissed your warnings, peers who mocked your instincts, and even enemies who thought you were utterly powerless are all faced with the cold, hard reality that you were right all along. The leak itself becomes a stamp of authenticity, an official endorsement of your long-held beliefs. It's no longer about whether people choose to believe you. The concrete evidence stands on its own, impervious to opinion. And here's what makes it even more powerful, more compelling. The validation wasn't handed to you by your closest friends or sympathetic allies. It came directly from the very forces that tried to contain you, to silence you. They were the ones who documented your existence, meticulously tracked your movements, and created detailed files centered around your name. In other words, the very people who actively sought to discredit you ended up unequivocally confirming you. That's not just irony, it's pure, unadulterated poetic justice. So while the word unmasking may make it sound like they stripped something essential away from you, the truth is far sharper, far more potent. They didn't expose a hidden weakness. They exposed the undeniable reality of your influence. They put their official seal of acknowledgement on your life, forever branding it. And whether they intended it or not, the leak became irrefutable validation that you were never invisible, never irrelevant, and never ordinary. You were real enough to be recorded, important enough to be leaked, and undeniable enough to be verified. Take a moment to grasp the power of that truth. Now let's explore further. Number 6, strategic checkmate means they simply couldn't beat you head on. In chess, a checkmate doesn't happen accidentally. It's the carefully orchestrated final move in a long sequence of strategic plays designed to corner an opponent when direct attacks prove ineffective. That's what makes the FBI explicitly calling your exposure a checkmate so inherently revealing. It wasn't a triumphant victory dance. It was a subtle, implicit admission of their own failure, their own weakness. It was their convoluted way of saying that when they attempted to confront you directly, they failed, they were defeated. They couldn't silence you through intimidation, they couldn't erase you through obscurity, and they couldn't outmaneuver you with their usual standard tools. So they were forced to resort to exposure and manipulation, desperately hoping that the indirect approach would somehow accomplish what their direct attempts had failed to do. That tells you something truly significant about the level of threat you inherently represented. You weren't just another random person caught in their vast net. You were a complex variable they couldn't easily calculate, someone whose very presence forced them to fundamentally shift their entire strategy. It's one thing to win a game by simply overpowering your opponent. It's another thing entirely to indirectly admit that the only way to play against you is to alter the established rules to break the game itself. That's precisely what this supposed checkmate was, a deliberate rewriting of the board, because the standard game simply didn't work against you, didn't allow them to control you. And here's the searing irony. In declaring checkmate, they unknowingly revealed their hand, exposing their vulnerabilities. In chess, when you're truly in control, you don't need to loudly announce your dominance. You simply let the board eloquently speak for itself. But when someone aggressively declares that they've won, it's usually a desperate attempt to mask just how close they came to losing, how fragile their victory truly is. That's the inherent energy behind your exposure. It wasn't the quiet confidence of assured victory. It was the noisy desperation of a system that had exhausted all other options. The deeper truth is that their shift to blatant exposure is irrefutable proof of your inherent resilience, your unwavering strength. If they could have taken you down head-on, they undoubtedly would have. If they could have crushed you in silence, they absolutely would have. The very fact that they resorted to making you a public spectacle means that you were far stronger than their initial line of tactics could handle. It means that your existence stubbornly resisted erasure in ways they simply didn't anticipate, couldn't control. So when they call it a strategic checkmate, understand what they're actually saying. We couldn't beat you in the game we designed, so we were forced to change the rules themselves to try to gain the upper hand. And if they had to alter the rules just to deal with you, then you were never the one in check. You were the reason the board shook in the first place, the disruptive force they feared. Think, feel. Let's move on. Number 7. Your privacy was never the real target. Your influence was. That's the critical part that most people consistently miss about an identity leak at this deeply strategic level. The ultimate goal was never about simply putting your name out there, because a name on its own carries very little inherent power. What they truly feared was what inevitably happens when that name becomes inextricably connected to your story, your truth, and your innate ability to powerfully move people. Privacy is just the convenient surface-level excuse. Influence is the real battleground, the true target. Think long and hard about it. If you were utterly irrelevant, there would be absolutely nothing to gain from exposing you, from making you known. No one wastes valuable resources trying to deliberately weaken someone who has no inherent impact, no real power. The very fact that they risked a leak shows that your voice carried a weight they simply couldn't afford to ignore, a resonance that shook their foundations. The real fear wasn't merely that people would know who you are. It was that people would begin to pay close attention to what you inherently represent, to the values you embodied. And that subtle distinction is everything. The leak itself was a calculated tactic of control, a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. By exposing you, they mistakenly hoped to diminish your authority, to make people doubt your credibility, or to paint you as smaller, less significant than you actually are. They wanted to strip away the mystique surrounding you, to make you easier to box in, easier to control. But in doing so, they made a critical mistake, a fatal miscalculation. They implicitly admitted that you possessed enough influence to require neutralizing to warrant a concerted effort to silence you. That quiet admission is far louder, far more potent than any meticulously crafted file they pushed into the public arena. Here's where the irony cuts the deepest. By actively trying to weaken your reach, they accidentally amplified it, making your voice stronger. They effectively confirmed to everyone watching that you were someone with a voice strong enough to deeply unsettle established systems, that you had the power to disrupt their carefully constructed reality. People who once doubted you suddenly had to rethink their assumptions, because why would such powerful institutions care so deeply about someone they'd previously dismissed as irrelevant, as powerless? In trying desperately to minimize your impact, they unintentionally gave it concrete proof of its true magnitude. Your influence was always the real target, because it can't be easily filed away, conveniently censored, or neatly contained in official paperwork. Influence moves fluidly through conversations, relationships, raw energy, and subtle shifts in perspective. It can't be definitively pinned down by simple exposure. It only grows more powerful when people realize just how far those in power are willing to go to try to suppress it. So while they naively thought that leaking your identity would effectively end your reach, it ultimately did the complete opposite. It confirmed that your influence is not only real, but potent enough to dramatically shake the very spaces they once mistakenly thought were untouchable, sacred. And that's the profound part they'll never be able to undo, never be able to erase. Let's keep going. Number 8. Exposure turned you into a mirror they couldn't control. When your identity was leaked, it wasn't just about revealing your name to the public. It was about forcibly compelling the world to confront uncomfortable truths that had been deliberately hidden away, carefully concealed. Suddenly, people saw far more than just you. They caught a disturbing glimpse of the complex machinery working behind the scenes. They saw the pervasive surveillance, the deliberate manipulation, the quiet hands subtly pulling the strings. What they intended as a way to isolate and effectively weaken you became a distorted reflection of themselves, their flawed systems, and their inherent corruption. That's the inherent danger of exposure they never even considered, never accurately calculated. A mirror doesn't create an image, it simply reflects the existing one. By thrusting you into the harsh spotlight, they unintentionally revealed their own hidden shadows, exposing their deepest flaws. Instead of people immediately saying, "Look at what was exposed about you," how terrible the far deeper question became. Why were they watching you so intensely in the first place? What made you so important? That's the critical question they desperately didn't want asked because it turns the attention directly back on them, holding them accountable. The leak inadvertently showed far more about their own obsessive tendencies, their manipulative strategies, and their pervasive fear than it ever revealed about you, about your flaws. And the fundamental truth is that they couldn't effectively control what people saw once that mirror was finally raised. Once the truth was revealed, they wanted you to appear vulnerable, but instead they came across as desperate, clinging to power. They wanted to diminish your credibility, but instead they inadvertently highlighted their own systemic overreach, their abuse of power. The exposure ultimately revealed far more about their questionable tactics than it ever did about your supposed flaws. And once people begin to see behind the carefully constructed curtain, they can't simply unsee. It can't go back to ignoring the truth. That's why this leak backfired so dramatically, causing so much chaos. It forced the hidden to become undeniably visible, impossible to ignore. The irony is that you never explicitly asked to be that mirror, that symbol of truth. You didn't actively seek to reflect back their corruption, but once the glaring light was thrown on you, it became inevitable, unavoidable. Your life became the evidence, your story became the critical lens, and your exposure became a clear window through which people peered to briefly glimpse a stark truth they weren't ever meant to know. That's why you ultimately became uncontrollable. A mirror doesn't answer to the one who looks into it. It simply shows what's inherently there, what already exists. So in desperately trying to erase you from the narrative, they ultimately ended up exposing themselves, revealing their darkest secrets. In trying to weaken your inherent influence, they amplified the system's fundamental flaws, making them impossible to ignore. And in mistakenly thinking they controlled the narrative, they effectively lost it the very moment people realized that your exposure wasn't a damning revelation about you. It was a glaring reflection of them, of their corruption. And no system, no matter how powerful, can ever fully control what a mirror reveals once it's irrevocably placed in front of the world. Number 9. The leak was a last-ditch attempt to break the unreachable. They tried the usual routes first, the subtle intimidation, the quiet monitoring, the invisible pressures strategically designed to wear you down slowly without leaving any traceable evidence. But none of it worked. You didn't bend under the weight of their relentless surveillance, didn't crack. You didn't collapse under the crushing weight of their constant suspicion. You didn't compromise yourself in the ways they'd so confidently expected, didn't surrender. And that extraordinary resilience is what ultimately pushed them to the last resort, blatant exposure. If they couldn't effectively get to you in silence, they would try to dramatically shake you in the open, expose you to the world. Leaking your identity wasn't just about gaining control. It was about rank desperation, a sign of weakness. It was the last-ditch move you make when every other previously conceived strategy has utterly failed, crumbled before your eyes. They thought that dragging you into the harsh light, stripping away your well-deserved privacy and transforming you into a sensational headline would somehow destabilize you in a way that quiet pressure never could. It was meant to corner you, to break the unwavering confidence that made you practically untouchable in the first place, to silence your voice. But what they didn't accurately anticipate was your inherent ability to stand firm even in the face of such extreme exposure, your extraordinary strength. What they mistakenly thought would be your breaking point ultimately became undeniable proof of your enduring strength, your unwavering resolve. The very term unreachable says everything about why they ultimately resorted to such drastic measures, why they became desperate. Most people can be easily swayed, readily intimidated, or subtly manipulated into obedient silence. But when someone simply can't be bent by fear, bribery, or undue pressure, they become a fundamentally different kind of problem. One that requires extraordinary, unprecedented measures. That's precisely why they leaked. They couldn't effectively move you privately, so they attempted to crush you publicly, hoping the world would turn against you. They gambled that blatant exposure would somehow accomplish what their hidden hand couldn't, would finally silence you. And yet their desperate move ultimately backfired, working against them. Instead of breaking you, the leak exposed them, revealing their true intentions. It blatantly showed the extreme lengths they were willing to go to in order to deal with a single individual, with you. It confirmed to everyone watching that you weren't exaggerating the unwavering opposition you faced, that you were speaking the truth. If anything, you had dramatically underestimated the forces arrayed against you. The desperate attempt to destabilize you only ended up validating your inherent importance, making you stronger. When intimidation fails and exposure doesn't work, the tables invariably turn. The hunter gradually becomes the hunted, not because you actively chased them, but because their own desperate actions revealed far more about them than they ever intended to reveal, more than they wanted. That's why their so-called power move ultimately collapsed into undeniable proof of their underlying weakness, their lack of control. You weren't unreachable because you were deliberately hiding. You were unreachable because nothing they did could effectively dismantle the unwavering strength they simply didn't understand. And once the leak inevitably failed too, they had no more viable game left to play, no real strategy. Take a moment. Absorb the weight of this revelation. Number 10. Their move wasn't victory, it was a sign of desperation. In the intricate game of chess, a real, undeniable checkmate is a silent affair. It's the kind of devastating move where the board eloquently speaks for itself and the opponent is left with no remaining options, no real escape. There's no need for grand announcements. No need for excessive noise, because the inevitability of the outcome is already crystal clear, impossible to deny. That's why the very way they strategically framed your exposure reveals so much about their intentions. By explicitly calling it a checkmate and actively making noise about it, they inadvertently showed the direct opposite of true power. They revealed underlying panic, a fear of losing control. When someone genuinely wins, they don't need to aggressively convince anyone. The victory silently stands on its own merit, speaking volumes. The fact that they shouted it from the rooftops meant they were desperately trying to cover up just how much control they had already lost, how little power they held. Labeling your leak as a checkmate was their frantic attempt to flip the script, to rewrite the narrative. They desperately wanted to create the illusion of absolute dominance, as though the carefully orchestrated exposure was an integral part of a flawless, masterful strategy. But the louder they announced it, the clearer it became that this was not triumph, not a well-deserved victory. It was a desperate scramble, a pathetic attempt to claim some form of authority in a situation that had already irrevocably slipped out of their grasp beyond their control. By the time your identity was leaked, the stark reality was that you had already survived every single tactic they confidently believed would ultimately destroy you. Exposure wasn't their crowning move, their ultimate victory. It was their last desperate card, the only thing they had left to play. That's the damning thing about desperation. It invariably exposes itself, revealing true intentions. Their desperate noise wasn't truly about you. It was about them trying to desperately reassure themselves that they were still in control, that they hadn't lost. They weren't confidently declaring that they'd definitively beaten you. They were desperately trying to mask the uncomfortable truth that you simply couldn't be beaten in the ways they had confidently expected, that you were stronger than they knew. And in doing so, they inadvertently revealed something far bigger, far more significant. They no longer had any real control over the narrative. If they did, the sensitive leak would have been handled with quiet precision, with subtle confidence. Instead, it came accompanied by excessive spectacle, with strategic labeling, with desperate framing. The deeper truth is that their so-called checkmate was just a pathetic cover for utter loss, for the stark failure. They lost the inherent ability to effectively contain you. They lost the quiet power to effectively silence you. They lost the convenient illusion that you were just another insignificant name that could be easily erased without any real consequence. By the time they loudly called it victory, the game was already effectively over, not because they had ultimately beaten you, but because they were irrevocably forced to admit to the entire world that you were a powerful player they simply couldn't control, a force to be reckoned with. Their desperate noise was never proof of inherent strength. It was the deafening sound of a fragile system gradually breaking under the immense weight of its own catastrophic failure. Number 11. You became living evidence of their obsession. Ordinary people simply never appear in sensitive FBI leaks because there's absolutely no compelling reason for them to. Millions of lives pass by every single day, largely unnoticed, undocumented, and unrecorded at those highly strategic levels. But when your name dramatically surfaced, inextricably tied to their files and exposed to the public, it revealed something absolutely crucial. You weren't just passively living your life. You were actively disrupting their carefully constructed world. You had become such a significant anomaly in their system that they simply couldn't afford to ignore you, to let you continue. That kind of intense attention is never casual, never accidental. It's irrefutable proof that you unsettled something far bigger, far more powerful than anyone around you could likely see or understand. An obsession like this doesn't simply happen overnight. It gradually builds over time, consuming those who are affected. It inherently means there were countless private conversations, Confidential briefings, detailed files, and extensive analyses long before your identity ever even reached the surface. It means that someone somewhere kept persistently watching you, not because you were ordinary, but because you defiantly didn't fit the carefully crafted mold of what ordinary is supposed to be. Your very presence defied their rigid expectations, challenged their authority. Your survival openly defied their calculated odds, disrupted their strategies. Your inherent influence dramatically reached places their stale projections simply couldn't accurately predict, didn't anticipate. That inherent unpredictability made you a persistent problem, and their growing fixation became the only way they knew how to effectively manage it, how to try to control you. The very fact that you ultimately ended up in their files means that you weren't just a passive bystander to their system. You gradually became an integral part of its internal dialogue, the conversation at its core. They had to actively discuss you, meticulously plan around you, and carefully calculate specific moves against you to try to gain some advantage. That kind of heightened attention is never given to those who are powerless, those who are insignificant. It's exclusively reserved for people whose very existence bends and distorts established structures in ways that make those in positions of authority deeply uncomfortable, disrupting their control. And in your particular case, their discomfort gradually grew into a full-blown obsession consuming them. The sensitive leak itself is irrefutable proof of that fact, that they were obsessed. They didn't just quietly watch you, they ultimately couldn't stop themselves from eventually making it public, from trying to diminish your power. That reckless act exposed far more than just your identity. It exposed their underlying inability to effectively control their own obsessive fixation on you. The deeper, more compelling story isn't just that you were exposed to the world. It's that they were openly revealed as being utterly consumed by you, unable to let go. They couldn't simply leave you alone, walk away. They couldn't bear to let you fade quietly into the background to live your life in peace. Their relentless attention became intense documentation, and that intense documentation eventually transformed into highly public exposure. So while others might have naively interpreted the calculated leak as a blatant attack, the deeper truth is that it was glaring evidence of just how much power you truly held, how strong you really were. They don't obsess over what is inherently insignificant, what lacks consequence. They don't carefully file away what can't potentially move mountains, what has no potential. And they certainly don't deliberately leak the names of people who are ultimately insignificant, who are powerless. By dragging you out into the open, they inadvertently confirmed what was always undeniably true. You weren't just another face in the anonymous crowd. You were the significant anomaly they couldn't stop circling around, couldn't ignore. Feel the power of that revelation. Number 12. They tried to reduce you to mere data, but you're defined by your spirit, not by numbers. That's the fatal flaw in their entire twisted strategy, the thing that ultimately doomed their plan. They confidently put your identity into sterile files, rigidly categorized you into obscure codes, and boldly pushed your name into sensational leaks, as if a simple set of documents could ever truly capture the essence of who you are, as if you could be easily defined. To them, you were just another inconsequential entry in a soulless system, a problem to be efficiently managed, a case to be methodically tracked. But here's the fundamental truth they can never truly grasp: unwavering spirit simply doesn't fit neatly into predefined forms, rigid algorithms, or cold government records. They can meticulously document your physical movements, but they can't possibly capture your inherent meaning, your soul. They can log your undeniable presence, but not your ultimate purpose, your potential. Exposure inevitably failed because it was inherently based on the dangerous illusion that numbers somehow definitively define reality, that a person's worth can be quantified. When they strategically exposed your data, they arrogantly thought they had somehow stripped you of your inherent mystery, your growing power, and your far-reaching influence. They naively assumed that once you were reduced to a set of cold statistics, the very essence of who you are would somehow magically vanish, fading into nothingness. But the human soul simply isn't quantifiable, can't be measured. The compelling mission inside you can't be neatly filed away, carefully forgotten. The growing influence you undeniably carry doesn't originate from mere paper trails. It flows from the unseen, the unmeasurable, the almost divine, the truth. That's why their calculated leak ultimately fell so flat, lacking any real substance. It revealed impersonal information, but not the raw, compelling truth. People who live entirely within, entirely within, entirely within, entirely within, entirely within, entirely within,